All right. Hello, this is Christian Idealism. I apologize. I have been absent for a while now. Today we have a new guest. His name is Alan. I'm not going to say his last name, but what we're going to be discussing today is neuroscience and free will. And so let's start off with the beginning part, which is, I'm sure everyone here is familiar with it, which is the live experiments, which demonstrate at least for a limited sense that our choices can be predicted 10 seconds prior to us actually making that choice. And so um, there's been a lot of people, a lot of atheists on YouTube and on the internet that have, a lot of determinists as well, that have argued that this is evidence that free will doesn't exist. Um, However, there have been numerous responses to this idea. And so that's what we're going to be discussing today, and how free will can still exist even within even with a purely physicalist model of the world, or even if you're a materialist, you still could hold to libertarian free will. Is that correct, Alan?
I'm not sure I use the word libertarian because you'll end up with people that are what are called impossibilists. That although of course impossibilists end up in their own regress where there's no desert, there's no guilt of anything. A murderer is just as unguilty as the next guy. But I think the most important thing to do would be to discuss it from a kind of an ontological standpoint, to be like, okay, so if this is true, we're just going to study the subject. Then what do you call that? Is it libertarian free will? Is it more complicated than we want it to be? But at the same time, it's important just to understand it. It doesn't point to the fact that we don't have free will. And from a Christian standpoint, really the thing that's most important is not deciding that we have this particular definition of libertarian free will, but if we have what's called desert reward, meaning when you are bad or good or have done something right or wrong, are you in a deontic logic that you can be accountable for the way you parse out the decision you make? So I think the Christian community's gotten too stuck on the concept of libertarian free will and not on desert, if that makes any sense.
What you're trying to say is, free will is like, it's so, because we deal with it every day of our lives. Like, there's not a single day where we're not, like, where the concept of free will is not being used, if it exists. Of course, if it doesn't exist, then we don't, we're not in control of our actions. So, are you talking about more responsibility, or just everyday choices?
No, well, I'm talking about moral responsibility, where because there's a regress when you get off into, you've heard kind of like terms, I guess Harris would bring up, which he calls is like, kind of like Dennett has spike trains all the way down, Harris has viruses all the way down. Meaning, if at one point you can't create a desert reward accountability, then you can always reduce that to you can keep pointing down to an ever more synchronized cause for cause. And instead, you can also look at it holistically and say, well, okay, good. We still have to come to some kind of a moral desert where, so I think the idea of like requiring something to be libertarian is not as valuable as discussing it from a desert point.
Okay, so what you're trying to get at is, like, there's this popular argument for determinism. It's not really a argument from science, but it's more of an argument from philosophy, where we can't choose our desires, and so whatever I choose to do will be the result of what I desire, and then whatever I desire will be the result of whatever I desire. It's like an infinite
right
loop. Is that what you're getting at?
The problem is you've got there's a certain system of thought where the desire you have, you've also navigated to that desire. So, one is this very bottom up bottom-up approach where you are tumbling through space and you are not a true agent. And the other one is like, well, why do you have this desire? Why do you have this portfolio of temptations in your life? And these are things that you have placed value on, you've sought, you've worked to purchase or gather, you've got friends or acquaintances or philosophies that you've pursued. And in the sense, the free will skeptic will say, you can't be responsible for any of those values and those criteria. But if when you're choosing a particular philosophy or item that will then apply in some way to some kind of a moral decision, if what you did is you chose it so that you could become somebody different, so that you could have a tool in the future by which you could then also, of course, leapfrog further into the future. The idea is that a person is not being shoved along by deterministic forces, but the agent is actually out cultivating their own criteria. So the thing that you are tempted of is the thing that you went out and have cultivated.
Okay, so I'm just trying to like wrap my head around what you.
So there would be enough freedom. So what you're saying is there'd be enough freedom. The more important question to focus on is enough freedom, in a sense, to have more responsibility from embodied agents.
Yes, if well, let's say we try to take the body and the kind of the motoric natural side of things, and then see us as a future tensing planner. Let's say we are a person on a four-wheeler and we are driving through, an area that we know we're going to run out of gas. So before we take this journey, we go and we get a jerry can with extra gas. Now, we've already created a tool by which we can have a greater distance of freedom on this four-wheeler, right? But we've had to pre-plan. We've had to go get a tool and place the tool with ourselves so that now then we've bought ourselves additional freedom by having additional fuel to go further. The phase space is kind of hard for people to gather because, we've got these counter-causal arguments where this mentality that you came upon this finite state transition-based moment and you were just, constantly like a domino. A person is making simultaneous decisions constantly. At any single microsecond, you might be making 100 simultaneous decisions that all have this graduated spectrum of phase and term. So you may encounter something where you realize this is going to affect how many different criteria, and then I'm going to make this decision because it's going to affect that many criteria. Each one has its own term and phase. So the idea that we are coming to these tiny little points where we're deciding these micro states is just not true. The micro states are being executed by these top-down macro states.
Okay, so you would say that the more important decisions are sort of determined by our micro decisions, or
now let's say a macro. The two words that are really important is to see kind of a dominance of a macro state, meaning if you would consider this a set of instructions, and that the set of instructions, a person you'll think, okay, then therefore I have a set of instructions. At any given point, we might have 100 or 50 different selves that we're managing. We're managing a self we're keeping healthy, managing a self who's in a relationship, who has a family, a professional self. We're managing a self that is managing time over different distances where we need to be making a decision that's going to be good for now, but also put us in a place 10 years from now. So when you're talking about this macro state, we're not even really talking about a single set of instructions. We're talking like a churning set of instructions that are dominating, like as a drop down to these little phased points where we have to choose at a certain point what's going to be the most beneficial that maintains the macro state. If that makes any sense, we're really more looking at the future tensing person as managing a garden and there are things that are long-term, short-term, mid-term, that
It's funny.
at the same time.
Okay, it's funny that you bring that up with regards to like changing you talk about like changing our nature over time.
Well, yeah, but for instance, let me read this kind of classic definition of this kind of a phase space freedom. It's the ability over time for an individual to navigate to a type of chooser as a top-down operation. The first order free will would be this kind of a biological, neurological, where we're managing decisions, and it's hunger, travel, friendship, leisure. These are generally small, order, non-important things. While we're doing that, we're also placing an image of ourselves into the future. What kind of philosophy do we wish to be capable of, let's say? So as you're this person in the present, you are also managing a person that lies in the future. I mean, we all have things that we want to study or things we want to master, and we're doing things now that will make us be able to, this is really important, make us have the ability to be a different type of chooser in the future. So not only are we making choices as a cultivation, of criteria and gathering these little things that will make us better choosers, we're gathering information and tools that are going to allow us to be a different person in the future, to make a different type of choice. Like, I mean, let's say you read a book on ethics. You're actually creating a different type of chooser. You are now the agent, not only of the now, but you're creating a future agent.
Okay, that sounds very similar to how the Holy Spirit changes people. I mean, this sounds very, very, very like I don't see how this could not be relevant, I guess. At least from a Christian perspective of like God changing your nature. He's like changing the way you choose things. I guess I don't want to get off topic, but yeah, I mean, Timothy, do you think that makes? I mean, it makes sense.
I'm not exactly sure what the different types of what sort of change is undergone in the brain. Like, what are we seeing in the brain that we can see these the change in nature take place?
Well, the new model, I think the thing that's difficult with free will skepticism versus this kind of newer neurological model is that the neural coding model has changed so much. Most of the arguments that you're going to hear from free will skeptics are based on what's called global workspace theory. Yeah. Which is very executive. What they're doing is they're saying, look, I could probably build you out of, different little bits and pieces. And if the fingers know where the eyeballs and everything's coordinated, I can make a person. And the problem is those modules of global workspace theory have turned out, because they're based on kind of a bus type system. No matter what, you could have all these simultaneous functions going forward, but you'd end up having kind of a central foe or a P-zombie-like agent at the top kind of managing. So it breaks the brain into a bunch of modules. The problem is the new models are realizing that what's called Hodgkin-Huxley, which is you hear about neural correlates as the way we think. The neural correlate has turned out to be kind of a secondary effect. What we have is a brain that the neurons do what's called aphatic signaling, and they send down an electromagnetic signal, kind of like a tiny antenna, and they look up surrounding neurons. So you have, not to get too technical into the neurological side of things or neurobiological, is you have a neuron that has two functions. One, which is a helical time scale that is looking up by this kind of a fractal-like a magnetic signal, looking up surrounding neurons, kind of like calling them on a phone. Let's say you got on your cell phone and you called 20 people at once, and they all picked up at once. And one of them said, "I've got a red teddy bear." The rest of them, "I got no red teddy bear in here." So it's like, got it, you. Now, while that magnetic potential is looking for a match, which is, we won't get into that, the action potential, which is this, this membrane potential that has to, we were more familiar with the neural firing, then will kind of punt in a sense, and then send the next group of queries to that. So you've got basically an EM broadcast, and then you've got a more electrochemical signal. So what we think of is when we look at the skeptic saying, well, we're still tied down to these tiny little like ones and zeros mentality. It's like, no, we're very bound. And the ionic portion of the brain, that's what we call it, where it's electrochemical and firing neurons, that's turning out to be kind of more like a power supply, because it's vibrating these structures, and those structures are then like kind of a Maxwell type of situation, creating an EM. So it's the staggered system. So we really should think of our brain as a whole piece of memory. And as we're making the decision, we're not broken into bits like a global workspace theory. It's more fractal in a sense, where we're able to see in a hyperdimensional, very layered way all of the things that we need to consider at once. So a moral decision isn't kind of logic based at all.
Okay, so now getting back to I guess the brain, because that's the important thing. When we're talking about global workspace theory, you mentioned P zombies. Now, on this model of the brain, I guess what I'm trying to ask is, let me try to go back to Peter Ticey, because I know you've cited him before, and when it talks to free will. So he talks about how there's two parts of the brain. You have the what's it called?
The volitional attention.
Yeah, the deliberate part, and then you have the part that's arbitrary. So the arbitrary deals with like just automotive, like if you're driving or if you're doing things that you don't really have to think about. That's the automotive, and that's where the readiness potential would be at. Now in the deliberate, that's not the case. You have it.
There's a little bit of correction there. C, his main focus is on what's called meta free will, and providing kind of a model of freedom through a physical model of the brain. But he isn't into the new aphatic signaling thing. The one that has to do with the deliberate versus arbitrary is Mayaz. And he's got about 5 or 6 papers, and he's a kind of a new guy on the scene. It's really fantastic. And what happens is if you think about this brain, think of it kind of like this kind of like vibrating, churning memory state. And it's somewhat fractal, and it's just imagine churning like when you see a farm combine chopping up wheat, and it's just like chewing it up. The brain is kind of churning a memory state that is kind of what it would consider true enough. It doesn't use logic, it uses synchrony. So we throw an item into this combine, and if it synchronizes, it'll get accepted and churned in. And that's so the brain is taking in are called chunks. It's called chunking. And every 250 milliseconds, the brain will introduce images, sense temperature, finger positions, items in the imaginary workspace, and this top cognitive clock will accept or synchronize or manipulate it in some way. So we have a pilot basically looking down on what was the modules of global workspace theory, kind of monitoring them and turning off autopilot on the modules if necessary, kind of like a volitional homunculus or warrior, which comes up with this Mayaz thing, because when they do the Mayaz test, when it's an ethical decision, the action potential flattens. The action potential, because see, here's the thing that, and I hate to keep talking, when we're thinking about the moment of awareness, like you look at something near you. None of that is an actual in-time experience. It's about 300 milliseconds late. So
no, yeah, there's a buffering, right?
yeah. So this concept that you have I call it an anja, which is an Eastern term for kind of a future tensing being that looks into the future. You have a being inside of you that is planning and cultivating a person and kind of like the manager. And if something's important, like in a Mayos test, it'll turn off autopilot and go over and say, hey, whoa, we're picking on a charity or something. Think this is important. It's not important. Just lets all the little gears go, because it's not, it's a Libet test is based on what's called arbitrary or picking. Push a thing, pick a dial. There's no ethical decision being made in a Libet test or a
right. Now I know Mayos. I sent Eric this study. I think it was on Friday, and it was that Mayos test about how they actually tested these patients, where they would ask them to like donate $1,000 or something, and what they found was that there was no readiness potential in those decisions, because those are more ethical or deliberate choices.
Yeah, so it's a sign of this top-down brain saying, slow down, I'm actually interested in this. But if it's how many pickles do you want on your sandwich or something like that, it's just not important. So a Libet, a person quoting Libet, that's kind of like an acid test. If they're like, well, in Libet it says, you're like, you're not up to date. It's just, that's old.
Okay, so would you, I know I keep on going back to Peter Ticey, but he does mention what's called self-selective neurons. Would you hold to that kind of view of neurons, or the more deliberate part of the aspect, or where our free will is happens, is where you have like these self-selective neurons that like are not determined or not random, but are more quote unquote free to do what they want?
He was in a Reddit AMA recently, and somebody asked him about that, and it seemed like he was a little bit behind. And I wrote him some stuff and gave him a ton of links. We email each other once in a while, and he's kind of in this slightly older model where there's a thing called a non-directed clique, and each neuron must have like 72 different options, and there's new images where neurons near each other are competing, and you can see the time scale where it's rotating back and forth, almost like two neurons playing ping pong. And none of this shows up in ionic. It's this electromagnetic. So you have neurons, especially if you think about the idea of Laplacian domain, where there's dominoes. At no point in a set of dominoes does a domino stop and wait for three other dominoes to get to a certain point. So are we good? And then, all right, let's all keep going. You have, with C's work, you have a thing where he's talking about informational causation takes the independent particle motion and turns it into dependent particle motion. And you end up having these neurons behaving as passwords, where they either will or they will not give up their information unless other criteria are met, which has really nothing to do with, natural motion of, states at all.
Okay. I'm trying, I don't know how to put this. Like, I'm trying to understand this. Like, is there a way you could explain it that it's very simple terminology like that?
What are you understanding, Kyle? Like, what specifically within?
I can understand like where he's getting at with regard to the readiness potential, and like there are certain. It's not a full one street. It's not like the whole brain's a domino where it's like cause and effect. Where no, there's actually like neurons won't do what they need to do without some criteria. I get that. It's just, I guess, I don't know.
Maybe if you kind of back up and you think, okay, I'm going to make a decision. The brain has this frequency state that it's maintaining. That is what it's the character. It's who you are. It's like this is Kyle. This is the way Kyle thinks. This is where Kyle wants to be in the future. Here's where I need to get Kyle and what I need to make Kyle avoid. And that's what your brain is doing. Is it is Kyle, and it's also future Kyle. It will, as it's passing through interference and competition, it will be trying to come up with tools that Kyle can gather and get Kyle to where all these other macro states are processed and are successful. As you enter into any particular moment, there's going to be a hierarchy of importance. Anything from like, what kind of car are you going to drive? Where are you going to move or buy a home, marry someone? These are long-term decisions. And you're going to encounter being drunk, sick, mad, happy, rain, snow, bored, manic. So when a skeptic will say, well, you don't understand, that decision you made then was impulsive. It's like, no, I've been working on this under every possible emotional state and physical state. I was sick, I was hungry. So it dissolves the impulsivity of the further you go out into these ethical deliberative decisions, the less impulsive of an argument you can make. From a neurological standpoint, it's kind of a blend, and it's not fun to think of, is that our actual person, we're locked out away from somewhat volitionally, because it's not the real time. To think, oh, I am me, I'm clapping my hands right now. Not so much. The thing that we experienced when we clapped our hands was, somewhat buffered. So it's just one of those things you have to kind of wrap your brain around. And a lot of this skepticism has to do with identifying the idea of the agent. If you can't neurologically locate what would be called traditionally a homunculus, a single questioner who has full, holistic view of all the memory and all of the needs and necessities of all these macro states, if you can't have something that's hovering over that at once, then you don't have free will, period. You are at some point in the system a behavioral model, in a sense. Thankfully, all this memory research points to fractal nesting of memory. So there's a big kind of halo circle that's your main slowest wave front, and then it keeps breaking down into these smaller, faster ones. So the idea that your brain is these wires is just not true. The wires are maintaining this fractal frequency state.
Hey, what's up, Alan?
You can talk, Gasper. Cool. If you want to ask any questions. I'm still trying to process this, but go on.
Right. So, okay. So what you're describing, ultimately, you're saying is proof that we have free will.
I don't know if we have free will, but I do know that we can be morally responsible for a lot of the decisions we make, because we navigated to the criteria purposefully to become the chooser that chose those from those criteria.
I see. So it's not necessarily intended to prove the existence of free will. Is it intended to negate determinism?
No, we are determined creatures, but by harnessing determinism, we've kind of taken Spinoza's prison and fashioned a key, so to speak. So to use the word determinism in these new neurological models is like, no, the state transition mentality of the point neuron model, where you have a 1 and a 0 or a combination of correlates, has lost out to this more fuzzy flowing broadcast of the self that basically uses geometric phase as the computational article. So you can imagine if I was to take millions of magnetic fluxes braided inside of braided, and you ask, okay, I need you to find a single state in that nest of magnetic flux. You'd be like, there are no actual states. I mean, it's just it's a nest, you know, it's a topology. It's not, I can't really point and say there's your state.
So okay, so if you're not going to make the jump right away to say that it's intended to prove free will, you are saying that we have enough control such that we can be accountable for our actions. Is that what you said?
To a certain extent, and I think that, let's say, I have been meditating on this idea of like, you hear a bear is a bear, and why does that not make us a bear? But if you think about each individual as a free device, you could have, that just becomes kind of a normative metaphysical argument to say, well, on an average, let's say you have a social expectation that this is what a society expects of a person. So if they don't achieve that particular choice, they have no free will. Well, it's really a choice. It's really kind of comparing ill will versus goodwill. It's not free will versus unfree will, if that makes any sense.
I see.
The will was free, and the choice they made was horrible. But it was a free, horrible choice.
This is a little bit less neurological and more in the realm of psychology. I always thought that if a person maybe had a deficit in executive functions and weren't able to block out certain thoughts in their mind in order to focus, or as I believe psychology would define focus, block out all irrelevant information for, whatever the object is you're trying to focus on, then, if a person couldn't do that, then maybe they could be said to have less free will than others. Because if you ask yourself what's going on in a person whose mind is being harassed by really bad chatter due to lack of executive functions, that they've got a lot of anxiety, they've got all this, worrying that's just keeping them from actually being able to stay on task and thinking about what they're doing. And so that you could probably, I don't know if you could, you could probably reduce that to neurological phenomenon, but whatever the thing that is causing them to concentrate is probably like the, big neurological smoothie that you were describing, like everything, synchronizing and being, culminating into one big
truthiness.
Yeah. And so that, it seems like that would be more like what concentration ends up being. And I've also heard that concentration relies on the prefrontal cortex. Is that right? You can double check me on that.
Yeah, it's sure.
I see. So and that's also where our personality is. And so like I've noticed on days when you feel really concentrated, you also feel like this sense of yourself, like in your head. Like it's really hard to describe, but you feel very present, like as yourself in your head and focus, and nothing, no weird thoughts can get in your head, But now, as for whether all of this adds up to free will or negates determinism, where do you stand on compatibilism?
Well, usually you'll hear that, compatibilism is just some kind of unworkable model because it's not respecting the limits of determinism. But it to me, I think that always is because it was modeled after some kind of Laplacian type thing, which doesn't philosophically stand up to dependent particle motion. And then it further doesn't work terribly well, as far as the critique to the idea that the brain is this bit-based networking model that at any point it is at a single dividable, crucial state. When you get off into this compatibilism idea, I think there's several. I don't have them off in my mind right now. There's like 3 or 4 compatibilisms.
You can tell me what you think, and then I'll offer you.
I don't remember the versions. I heard a couple versions the other day. I was like, gee, I didn't know that existed. I normally like to stay away from a label because I think it causes me to pursue a label as I'm studying. So I'd rather, have somebody who's better at philosophy than I am be like, well, then that's what you're talking about. Because I think philosophical definitions of free will cause a person to then study for that, and pursue it. And
right. And then there's a bias. Yeah.
Yeah. When you get off into this quality of will type thing, like you're talking about the concentration level, one thing, since you guys are much better philosophy than I am, Bobby, and that's not an extreme understatement. The idea would be you could almost describe, is there kind of a normative debate here? Let's say you have a tribe, and in this culture, if someone lies to you, you are supposed to murder them. And if you murder them, you are now a good person. And everybody, you know, says, well, he had the guts to do it. He's a noble person. We would, from our normative, look at that and go, that's terrible. He's a victim of their social structure, and he has murdered this person unaware that this is totally wrong. So we have to kind of look at what definitions of a person's quality of will or what decisions they make are, you know, basically just juxtaposed against what we've already defined as right and wrong. Because I think a lot of people get lost in the idea of what decision was made. If you start looking at the brain as just a free device, because if you I'm sure you guys are familiar with Plantinga calling kind of unlimited free will is maximal autonomy.
Yeah.
If you start looking at maximal autonomy, you end up with that would be one end, and then you have the impossibilist on the other. Like, I don't care what brain model you come up with, I got something for you. And then you end up needing to be able to travel through time, shapeshift, and fly in order to satisfy. And then at the same time, it'd be like, no, this person needs to have read every book on philosophy and have 10 PhDs, and then also, you know, have they won't allow. And it doesn't make sense, because at some point you are capable of making some kind of a rational decision at any particular point, especially if it's a deliberate, which is why criminal law has different, you know, spectrums of intent, you know, or premeditation.
I see. Yeah. So, okay. So, Kyle and I talked about this the other day. So basically, yeah. Well, first of all, Alan, I'm not a big fan of the labels in philosophy either. For that reason, well, because they, I believe, come with a lot of baggage, and they often allow people to, in a lazy way, circumvent the actual argument itself and just avoid a brand that they don't like. So I think every argument should be spelled out every time. Okay, so long story short is, I might propose a possibility where free will and determinism are not mutually exclusive. And now a lot of the neuroscientific concepts you're talking about right now, you know, they're awesome. I haven't heard of these concepts you're talking about, and I'm sure plenty of inferences can be drawn from them. But the approach I've always taken has been more of a pure conceptual approach. So first, you know, I tend to think an idea can be judged not just based on its metaphysical value, but maybe actually just on its usefulness. So maybe, you know, a little bit of pragmatism, right? And then I also think reductionism and emergence are both useful in different contexts. And so for that reason, I think the question of whether free will and determinism is more like whether you want to use 4 quarters versus a dollar bill.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
And if you get bullied into one of the, you can get bullied into one or the other. Like if I have a dollar bill, you know, and some, you know, autistic reductionist comes up to me and says, "No, you actually have 4 quarters." You know, it's actually 4 quarters. It's 25 plus 25 plus 25 plus 25. It's like, well, it is a dollar bill, is it not? It's like, no, it's 4 quarters. And then, you know, we could keep going. It's like, well, it's 100 pennies. It's like, well, they're not wrong. But you know what? I'm going to feed this into this Coke machine real quick, like, so I can get a Dr. Pepper.
Mm-hmm.
And that was useful. It was useful for me to have a dollar bill. I didn't want the 100 pennies or the 4 quarters. And so the format causes things to be more ergonomic in certain contexts. Another example I'd say is, you know, so to me, it's an issue of format. Like, for example, in math, you know, we may want something to be a percentage, a decimal, or fraction based on what postulates we want to use on it, you know. And the information on the inside is the same, but the format allows us to use different rules. So format allows for pragmatic ergonomics. And so I take that same concept to free will and determinism. If you're having problems with your relationships, you don't want to consult a neuroscientist. You may want to consult a therapist, possibly. If you have a tumor, you definitely don't want to consult a therapist. So it's more of, whether you want to look at it as a behavior issue versus a neurological issue is depending on the problems you're trying to solve at the time. So that's kind of how I look at that whole dichotomy.
Yeah, I think that the danger of it is there's like these polar arguments that you end up with very kind of a social justice mentality where if you can't be responsible, at any point, there's no responsibility at all. You have here's what's strange. I'm sure you've heard this, where the impossibilist will, write their incredible paper about how it's impossible and then be like, but what we really need to do is pretend that we have it.
Yeah.
Or you have the other idea where there's all these paradoxes, and the progressive, which is often progressives are going to be free will skeptics. It seems to be the case. I guess that's more of a moral, like it relieves more guilt from bad behavior. You'll have the case where they'll say, but let's pretend that we do. You'll have the case where they're like, well, we need to get this person into some kind of a rehabilitation center so that they can not do this anymore, which really kind of somewhat contradicts their point, because they're saying if we could have given this person greater tools, they would have made a different decision. It's like they're kind of saying they had the will to do what they did. They just now it doesn't make sense. But what I also think is strange is the idea of the paradox between nothing being genetic, where we are all constructs of society and we are all nurture-based, beings, that everything's environmental. But then when somebody, which would obviously always deny any kind of genetic advantage as far as cognitive abilities, which always has to do with, choice making. But then at the same time, the free will argument says that this person is only able to make these types of decisions according to their cognitive abilities. So you have a kind of a taking and leaving genetics where it's advantageous for the argument.
I see. Yeah. So here's a way that I've thought about. So there's the whole product of your environment. You're a product of your environment, and everything you think is unique about your thoughts is you're just a product of your environment. And that's where the whole social justice movement comes from.
Unless you killed somebody, then you genetically couldn't help it. Which so sorry for interrupting, but that's how it works.
Yeah. So and when you do look at it, you can actually trace, like, okay, so let's you got all these disabilities, grew up in the projects, parents were meth addicts, we're not surprised when that person grows up to be not the next president of the United States. Right. But then again, we need to ask, if we follow the approach of ergonomics, or which approach is more usable. Okay, the people judging him may like, if we were the judges judging him, we might be like, okay, look, maybe we'll just send him to some kind of freaking therapy or mental institution because he's somewhere in the middle of a long line of really bad dominoes. Okay. Mm-hmm. So we like, maybe there are times when you want to take a deterministic position to maybe judge someone less harshly, but the best position may not be that for him. That person, the best position for them may be more of a free will. It's like, okay, I've been screwed in life, but you know what? I gotta make decisions. I gotta decide my way out of this,
Right.
And so the way I thought about it, and I had this dilemma, is the way I thought about it is like, okay, so some person had really terrible parents. They grew up to do all these terrible things, and that person, you could just judge them and say, hey, guess what? Suck it up. You're responsible for your actions. But what about that person's parent? That person's parent will always be able to ask themselves, is there something I could have done differently?
Mm-hmm.
And the answer is yes for both of them. The answer, you know, that person's responsible for their actions, and the parent could have done other things, like infinitely many different decisions, as many, you know, just as you can make segments, you can divide a line segment into, you know, many little groups of points, you know. So it's about arbitrarily slicing up one cause and an effect. So
also the question would be, I think of it as kind of a distance of navigation. Somebody that's in a desperate position in you know, the inner city. I've done inner city ministry for 10 years, so I'm familiar with how difficult it can be. A huge accomplishment of a person's exercising some kind of a moral judgment and free will would be for them to travel a distance that most people would still consider immoral. You might have a person that says, well, I used to steal 4 cars a month. Now I'm down to 1. And we're like, that's terrible. They think they're being more moral than they used to be. I don't beat people up. I just this. I do less of that. So I think when we think of the person in this normative argument being that what's the quality of their decision making, if the device is free to me, if you hand me this box and you say this makes nonlinear, highly holistic, you know, phase-based decisions, when it's deciding for itself, it's deciding hundreds of decisions simultaneously on several different terms, some 10 years from now, some 200 milliseconds from now. Then you would ask me, is this device operating freely? I'd say, well, ontologically, it just sounds super free. It sounds like it's really got a lot going on in there, and it's not constrained by some algorithmic restriction, state transition type thing. So when we take that device and we put it in somebody who's disadvantaged, the expression of their freedom may never be good decision making, but it just even better decision making is that device making free decisions. If that makes any sense, it's we just need to quit thinking free will is some expression of good.
So are you saying that our brains are not like computers?
No, well, I mean, they're information processors, but they're more like blenders and walkie-talkies than computers, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'd say I'm not a big fan of them being related to computers at all.
Yeah, I mean, even a quantum computer, like a quantum computer is still a computer. Like,
yeah, a quantum computer still unpacks classically. If you think of a quantum computer, you can think of a teacher in a classroom. Let's say she can line up, you know, all 12 students and ask each one of them, do you have my, you know, say something that she, you know, just disappeared off her desk. Do you have my paperweight? Do you have my paperweight? And she could do a qubit version. She's still boop, 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 boop. Or she can stand in the middle of the classroom, line all the kids up around the walls of the room and say, who has my paperweight? And one kid goes, I do. That's what the brain does. It's simultaneous across all space at once. And it's not asking each one, do you?
Okay, so, okay, I think that's a way better way of understanding it. So what you're saying is, a computer would be asking one at a time. A quantum computer would be asking simultaneously, and then you know, in our case, our brains would kind of be the one standing in the middle, just asking who has it.
And it could be 1 million students or 2. It could be 10 billion students with one question, who has it? It's found. I have it.
So it's actually faster than a quantum computer.
It's slower in frequency. It's about the speed of a Celeron, but the architecture is faster.
Okay. Okay.
Whatever it is and whatever it does, it is able to make what we call the inductive leap. It's able to make analogies and metaphors, and that's stuff that computers and AI are still really clumsy at.
There's, you know, for the longest time, Anirban Bandyopadhyay had his fit model, and the lookup is what's called associative geometry, which has to do with as soon as three or more vertices of some kind of agreement in this basically geometric memory are met, it says that's close enough. And then on the vertices, new questions pop up. So it's like a pop-up book. Well, for the longest time, that was like, that's just the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. That is crazy. But they're like, well, it's what we're seeing, because he does all this nano imaging.
Yeah.
Rabinovich in Russia, it sounds like he's not even looked at Bandapagye's work, comes up with what's called winnerless competition, where he says the brain asks like 3 questions, and then in this kind of like, if I set 3 people in a triangle and I said, what do you think? What do you think? Well, the third person's asking the first person, and then a general, they do kind of a meh, and that's true. Whatever they all say, that's close enough. And then his diagrams look extremely similar to Bandapagye's fit models. And then this guy, Nurlahav, discovered just last year, was huge, that synchrony and chaos is found in the low density. And both these two memory models have to do with these low density truths, not getting to a true. Whatever's true first and fastest in the low density is then said, fine, that's close enough, we're going to move. But now you think about free will, you know, a person is required to be making right versus wrong, you know, these logic.
Yeah.
The brain's not using logic. It's using only induction and inference and Gestalt. It's just going, that's good. That'll work.
Right. Now, this is kind of stupid, but they say that our brains are like way more powerful than the world's best supercomputers, even though supercomputers are pretty damn good. And, you know, they require like a lot of electricity, a lot of power, but our brains don't seem to require that, despite the fact that they, like, they're better
Well,
than supercomputers.
It's goes, one, the brain doesn't generate heat, but that's, I don't want to get too complicated, but
Okay.
the axon used to be thought of as this little wire that electricity would flow down, and, you know, there's different ways to manage it with these, you know, these astrocytes. Turns out that the lipids are crystallizing and behaving as little piezoelectric dominoes in a way. And I think the energy they're going to probably in about 5 years say is actually spiraling down the axon or around it. So what we have is this system where, as the heat from the electrochemical energy, you know, ignites, it goes into this hole, water rushes in, crystallization, it then during crystallization pushes the water back out. So you have this on-site thermodynamic balance, so that you don't create heat. It's almost like every single tiniest point in the brain is self-cooling because of this action between the electrochemical and the piezo.
And I thought I was under the impression some amount of heat was generated, but I could be wrong.
Well, no, the numbers, when they look at it electrically, are supposed to be like, I don't know what the number is, something crazy. Like it should be 2,500 times hotter than that in that small space. But because of this piezoelectric to ionic effect, and they think it's the water rushing in and rushing out through this little, you know, ion channel during crystallization, that it's actually creating a, I'm not a thermodynamics guy, there's papers about this, creating a self-cooling point. I mean, so you can imagine if every single space, as it tries to create information, is also cooling itself simultaneously and almost simultaneously. That's why it's not making any heat.
I see. That's
I mean, it does chew up some calories, but it's nothing close to the way it should.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it does need energy, but yeah, not that much apparently.
Compared to, yeah.
So, we're all evolution people in here, right?
Yeah.
Nice. Yeah. Stuff like that really makes me think about how dope evolution is. You know, the whole spiraling that you're describing. But anyway. Yeah.
The spiraling, of course, has to do with exploiting primes and the way things like to kind of divide in that way. I'm not a math guy. But also the spiraling has to do with the single cell organism treating itself kind of like a clock. If you think about it, kind of let's say you have a 2D world and you just want to, every so many at a beat cycle of some sort, you want to get a reading on your surroundings. So you have these actin filaments when you're very primitive, which turned into cilia. And you're just getting you're just basically like have a spotlight that's rotating around you, taking a reading. And these cells have polar coordinates. And there's a north pole to these animals. After a while, these cilia become more and more sophisticated, that they're getting a temperature reading, they're getting a vibe, and it's all frequency based. They're basically just have this little thing turning around them, constantly getting a reading. Well, the cilia then start having spinning information on them to kind of complexify and braid the information coming in. So you end up with, I don't know if you're familiar with slime molds, but you've got this collision computing model at the surface that takes in the vibrations and all the frequencies that then the information spun up inside these microtubules is what's basically braided sum of phasors. And I guess what's happening, because it keeps stepping to the neuron and then to the down the axon, is this. If you think of information in the brain, it's like if I took 3 threads, let's say, and I made a braid, and then I took 3 braided threads of 3, and I braided those, and I took 3, and the information is bound like that. It's braiding of braidings of braidings of information.
Okay, so you say that the brain is what's it called? You said computer or something like that.
Processes information.
I know, but like there's like a certain computing that it does. What is it called again?
Well, I'm not sure. I think we mentioned earlier it was more like walkie-talkies in a blender.
Well, I know, but like there's a certain term you use for describing that type of information processing.
Like fit, you mean?
Yeah, like what, like we're not talking like a classical or a quantum computer. We're talking more like you said earlier, a fractal machine or a Godot. Well, okay, let's get into the Godot machine, because this is I think more to the point of learning how to learn, because that's what a Godot machine is. And so would the brain be that? I'm assuming it would. I mean, right?
Yeah, you only have a few embedded kind of things in permanent memory. I think one of them is to hold your breath if you go underwater. What else is there? I think there's breastfeeding or something. I mean, there's very few things that you don't learn on the outside. But as you can look at Piaget's work and stuff, as you're growing up, you're figuring out, as a baby, what a wall does. Is there something behind the wall? How the space works. You're figuring out, you're coding all of your grid cells in your hands and your knees and feet. Like see a kid constantly grabbing his foot. He's confirming, okay, that's something that's connected to me. As soon as you've got these grid cells all wired up, you now have what's called a gestalt bubble around yourself. You draw, like we think I'm in a 3D space. I'm at a desk. I've got my, things around me. That is a computer monitor that your brain builds for you. That's a sphere. And when you see your hand in front of you, your hand is not in front of you. That is a representation of your hand that your brain renders, knowing
right.
all the fingers are located. And it's, what it does is you got 3 spatial distances. You got the landscape, which means if you're in a room, you know which direction downtown is. Then you've got your kind of more local, which is your house, let's say, or your street, which how your house is configured. But you probably couldn't tell which direction your house points compared to downtown. It becomes very general. You're like, I think we're, And then you've got your own body, and your brain is constantly monitoring these separate spaces, preparing this false image of yourself.
Okay, so I would say you would be a representationalist, right, when it comes to perception?
Yeah, there is no way we are seeing the real world. Impossible. It's on delay. The brain, when they look at eyesight and the way it syncs hearing and touch and how it manages shapes and kind of morphs them in imaginary workspace, the brain is taking in this income, it's mostly frequency data. It's, smell is quantum frequencies and olfactory. There's hearing, which is, vibrations in the air, sights, photons. You're basically a frequency collector. Think of yourself as a bat. You think, oh, well, bats, all they see is frequency in the dark. How's that work? All we see is frequency in the dark. There's no such thing as color. There's no such thing as light. We're converting photons into illumination.
Okay, now I'm sure
What
you.
are the implications there for philosophy of mind? What do you
Yeah,
think?
I was gonna ask that. I was just gonna ask that.
For one's philosophy of mind.
I mean, I don't know. I used to be. I'm all over the map. I used to be. I'm going to be an idealist. I've kind of bumped it over to ontic structural realism 1. I think it's more consistent, because even I think objective idealism requires too much observer participation, where ontic structural realism has more of a kind of a co-forming model, where because time's getting kind of really kind of hot vibration-ish in a way, that's a word, you end up really doubting that you aren't just a synchrony between another synchrony, like you're 2 pages of books, turning each other's narrative together. So it's hard for me to just seclude myself into this system that's not being synchronized by outside systems.
Well, isn't ontic structural realism, isn't that scientific realism?
Well, if you do OSR 1, you're like toes on the line on objective idealism anyway. It basically just says that only relations are real.
I agree with that, actually. That's actually, I mean,
Right.
that's my view of, I mean, when it comes to scientific realism, because I mean, here's the thing, is like there's a lot of, when it comes to like the better objection to my metaphysics. What?
Finish what you're saying, then I'll ask you.
Okay, when it comes to my view of metaphysics, there are some objections, like the good ones, that have to do with whether or not science is possible. And so I guess ontological structural realism would be kind of my view, that science is kind of like studying these structures of reality that exist independently of us.
Now there's 7 different ones, so you can go down all the way to 5 and 6, and things start becoming more, Steve Carrollonian. But in general, the number 1 is very abstract.
I wanted to jump in. Who asked what the implications were of
Timothy? Yeah, what were you gonna say to me, Timothy? Or did you forget?
It was something about the different. I just need to be refreshed of the differentiations between OSR 1, 2, and 3.
I could look it up real quick.
Yeah, I would have to know too, because
I know that OSR 1 is like objects and properties are not ontological.
Well, I was going to say that what he was saying about us not seeing the true representation of reality. We can follow that rabbit hole all the way down to the brain and the vat, and this is where I once again would emphasize pragmatism. So, like, of what use is that information to us?
Okay, who wants to read these? I can read them, or somebody else can. 1 through 3.
What?
Ontological structure.
I've got the OSR 1 through 3. I've got all 7. Of course, I think 6 and 7 are pretty brief. All right, I'll read them. Number 1, there are no individuals. There is only relational structure. For example, and this is from Ladyman, 2009. For example, certainly universals a la Platonism presuppose formal properties that are independent of the contingencies of their instantiation. To say that all there is are relations and no relata is perhaps to follow Plato further and say that the world of appearances is not properly thought of as part of a content of knowledge. I'm actually going to post that on the...
Yes,
that's a really mathematical way of
I'm like,
things.
yeah, I just got a migraine trying to figure that one out. Let me put it on the Facebook thing.
Hold on.
Let's see. So what's up? What else? What else, guys? What's going on?
Well, I mean, to me, as an idealist, I would grant that what we see isn't real, but I would caution that what's out there is not matter, so to speak. It's qualia.
You know, there's a lot of the idea of qualia. The more I study, I'm like, no, there is such a thing as qualia, but it's only in the brain. There's no. Can anybody the idea that I've heard some of these strict subjective idealists that all there is qualia? I'm like, no, there's no qualia at all. There's nothing.
Well, yeah. Can I jump in here? Okay, so you mentioned that colors aren't real, right? And so, like, it's not just in our brain. Like, whatever it is that we actually think is the world, the colors, all the vibrations that you described coming in, plus arguably our abstract concepts like math and logic, those could all be reduced down to qualia.
Or I even like almost instead of saying qualia, let's say just frequency spectrum.
Well,
pressure density, heat mapping, cold to hot, Kelvin. You know, just basically these tiny little animals saying, I'm going to choose what's dark and light. And it's like, well, actually, you need to add a third color. Okay, we're going to have dark light and gold, dark light blue and gold, dark light cyan, gold and green. By the time you're done, you've assigned micro identities to these different, versions of color. But at the same time, you're only measuring incoming frequency. You never were measuring color.
Yeah, it's I may be mistaken. I thought qualia was meant to talk about some kind of subjective phenomenon. Is that right?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure how much it has to do with free will, but the idea that while we are in this, choice-making world and we're interacting with objects, we're, pretty much locked out as far as the representational model of a real-time experience of what we're doing. We're basically sending an image to an avatar that we call the volitional self.
Man, your stuff's pretty tripped out, man.
It's not. I mean, it's what the data says. I don't want to say that. If I wanted to be biased, I'd say that's BS, man.
No. I'm not saying it's BS. It's just.
I'm like, oh man, that's terrible.
We're not saying it's BS. It's just.
Yeah, I'm not saying it's BS either. Like I mean, I obviously don't. Like it makes sense. I don't know the data to verify it, but
one thing.
Just saying, it's out there.
One thing that I came across that I like, because you have this Anja that's like planning all these macro states. It's got plans for all different things it wants to do, and then it's of course turning off autopilot and saying, whoa, did somebody say something that's important to me? It's like, well, we're actually picking out a pizza. It's like, yeah, I'll work on that. But let's say you've promised your loved one that you're going to eat better, more healthy, and your kids want you to, not die. So now a pizza may be an ethical decision. It's like, crap. Now, even when you've made that decision, and you've got that little 300 millisecond buffer that then prepares this image of yourself, a volitional image of yourself doing it. There's this thing called NV400, which is the double take, which after you've told the waitress, and I'll have another pitcher of beer, 400 milliseconds later, it's like, are you sure? So it's weird how not only are we planning a future, we're then making a decision. And then the NV400 zone of the decision is a confirmation signal to be like, you're sure you want to do this? And it's all happening, of course, very quickly. Of course, there'd be rapid sets of NV400s. But even when we say that there's this chunking avatar that's buffered and prepared that says, here's where your hand is, more or less, like you can't hit a fly because where the fly is, where your hand and the fly are, that the fly's not there anymore. That's why you can't hit a fly. Your hand is buffered too much to be able to sync a fly and a hand together. But it does even still strangely give you a second chance at changing your mind after the buffer has been presented.
Okay, so what you're saying is that would you say that the feeling of free will is an illusion?
Yes, that's definitely true. The volitional, hey, look what I just did, is an illusion.
Okay.
Because you didn't just do it. You've done it. You did it a little bit ago. And
right.
now
Okay.
you're getting the image of having happened in some kind of a synchronized state.
But okay, let's consider this. Okay. Yes, in that way, it's an illusion. And by those hard standards, colors are also an illusion as well, right?
Yeah, there's the color is just frequency.
So
Right, but there's a reason. But there's a reason to. There's also time to just let colors. I mean, they have a meaningful use still, though, right? In the form as we, in the form as they are, without reducing them. And you could say that we could do the same thing with what Kyle just described, right? I mean, it could sometimes be meaningful to not reduce it to that delayed response.
Yes, because I mean the qualia are going to be part of the moral decision. You know, if you're choking somebody, you're going to say they're trying to turn them purple. You're killing them. Purple's qualia. You have to make a moral decision based on some of the input that you're getting from the external world. So yeah, qualia is not just for shits and giggles or something.
Yeah,
real life moral value.
Yeah, now, I realize. I know this is being recorded, so I'm just gonna say my use of qualia was mistaken. I looked it up since then, and yeah, I guess it's been a while since I even used that word. But yeah, it's not having to do with subjective mind phenomenon. It's something different. So anyway, yeah. Anyway.
I don't think I've ever read a definition of qualia. For all I know, I'm using it wrong.
Yeah, it's just like phenomenon. I think it's actually like probably meant to be used a lot in phenomenological.
No, it's used in like intentionality and phenomenology mostly. So
okay.
Because intentionality would have to do with like free will, consciousness, the mind, and so forth.
Oh,
phenomenology's all right. They just circumvented Kant. Like, Kant put a really hard problem in front of everybody, and everybody decided to walk around it. It's like, there's a hurdle on the running track, and it's too tall for people to jump over, so they walk around it. That's in my opinion what happened with Kant and what phenomenology is.
Now, this is the coolest of. I mean, the emphatic signaling stuff. There, that's interesting. The coolest qualia discovery of last year was called reverse memory lookup. If you go back to this model of this winnerless argument where just there's these low density sinks, we think the original model was that the brain, when it encounters apple, it's going to find red and apple and fruit and make a judgment on if it's fresh or not, how hungry it is. It's going to go through all these, executive functions to apply some value to the apple. What they found out by doing these mnemonic inference tests when we see objects and then what part of the brain lit up, and they can locate what those parts meant definitionally, is that when you see the red apple, you, instead of thinking apple, you first think of the mnemonic meaning of the apple, which may mean teacher. It might mean help.
Yes.
This is
very interesting.
This is backwards. But what you end up with is the idea that there's a convergence between the object and the subject. Because
I love the topic of mnemonics.
The object is coming at you in these sense data chunks. You basically have the brain having all these things thrown into the blender. But instead of it saying like, oh, wow, a piece of wood. Oh, wow, a piece of paper, it's saying, oh wow, home, oh wow, information, oh wow, a book I love. And then it's like, well, what's the book about? It's like, I don't know, I love it. Oh yeah, I do remember. And then it goes further and opens that up more fractally to why do you love it, and then it finally gets down to it's written by this author, the more objective things about the book. So what you have, which was this, kind of like the mind body problem, which is always like, oh, how do we see this object subject type, thing blending? is as we are navigating through the world, we are hashtagging everything with its most fundamental value to our person, our internal, like our soul. And the objective information that we, assign to the object is done last. Of course, it's done really fast, but we're not seeing things objectively. We're seeing things subjectively in a value sense. So if you think about everything, it's basically hashtagged.
Yeah. Huh. Okay. So like, it's really interesting. Okay. So how you described how we go about remembering things. There's a book on mnemonics that I had, and it covered how to like remember your past. Now, like you could try to do it just brute force and just think back, but there's a certain order you can do things in which will actually yield more information.
Right.
So like if you want to remember your childhood, first just remember all the houses you lived at, and then from the houses, think about the different grocery stores nearby or the gas stations. First, get the places solidified, and you actually imagine going through them, and then like the people and where they used to be in there, and basically the whole standard of mnemonics basically has 3 items. It's people doing actions with objects, but you could add a fourth, and it would be place. So
that would actually that actually, because I've done a few plays before, and that's the same thing where you have to remember where to go. Like if you're in a play, like you have to like know your blocking, you have to know your lines, you have to know what you're gonna say, when you're gonna say it, and so forth. And that's basically what you just described is exactly how actors have to prepare for a play.
Well, think about how important spatiotemporality is in memory. Let's say an event happened. You had a friend tell you something that hurt your feelings or something. Let's put some like hashtags on it.
Yeah.
The each word and expression on their face and sentence that has a temporal factor to it also had a limbic chemical, response added to it as you got excited that they had news, and then the news was bad. So you have this glissando of, this is bad. But from good to bad is a temporal state. You've gone from one to the next, and you've had a transition. So as we do this mnemonic thing, what we're doing is we're not just saying, hey, I just want to remember some stuff. It's like, listen, if you'll get to the spatial temporal point, just give me, that's your best lookup, is where were you at that time? It will then start popping up like the memory's like a pop-up book, you pop it open and there's this huge thing underneath. It's like, if you can get me to the right point, I can then open up all the chemicals that represented the emotions you had at the time. I can represent all the ideas and the hopes and dreams you had as that person. And you haven't even gotten to whether you had this toy or that toy. You don't remember what color your bike was at that time. It's really going to only remember the state of the human that you were at that time most actively.
Yeah.
So it's like a system restore.
Something like that. The most solid parts of your memory are going to be the emotions and the qualities that you placed on the space and the general. It's kind of, you don't really need to remember the specifics, but it mostly remembers the person you were and the type of emotions you had at that moment.
Okay, now with that in mind, does that have any, this kind of goes back to Timothy's question earlier, which is, but does this have any implications on philosophy of mind? Because, if space and time are, in our minds, so to speak, like that seems to, I'm not saying it's in our heads. Okay. It's just in our minds, I guess you could say it's in our heads, but, that seems very odd.
Well, the only thing that I think disturbs me about when you want to do a philosophy of mind and you want to attach matter to memory is special relativity, because you can't tie the particle's motion to the event and the
No, that's
event.
the problem. No, yeah, that's why that's an issue.
Now, here's what I am trying to study this year is that the brain has a topology to the memory, being this kind of fractal 3-sphere fractals inside of this bunch of spheres that are all unpacking each other and synchronizing. And in the middle between these 3 spheres is this imaginary workspace that's maybe some kind of a space filling curve or some sort that allows you to not only walk through a 3-dimensional space, but maintain yourself, taking in the data, and also hashtagging every item. That my friend gave me that. That's a Valentine's card. You know, I should clean that up. It's hashtagging intent and, you know, all these values to everything. They're not just objects. But you think, okay, so we're going to need a topology of the brain and the memory that's natural. That if the brain and space-time somehow work together, then space-time or whatever kind of a topological vector space that's managed space-time, because right now we're just using whatever works. You know, they got Fano planes and who knows, Octonians. You'd be like, well, let's look at the brain, and maybe the brain and the topology of the universe look extremely similar. If you can say that's the information architecture in the brain, you could just as well say that's the information architecture of the universe, and somehow that works all together.
Yeah, well, that has huge implications with regards to theism.
You know,
that's a different discussion, but I mean, yeah, I mean that's what I kind of thought. I kind of thought that the universe would resemble a brain, to the extent I don't know.
Well, from the information architecture standpoint, like if you were look at an illustration of a network, and you'd be like, oh, what are all these lines? It's like, oh, those are servers, and that's that. You're like, oh, so I'm not looking at servers. I'm looking at architecture. It's like, yeah, you're just looking at the way they're connected. And there's one subject that you guys might want to cover someday, and I've been studying it, is this kind of a new age religion experience with people doing DMT. And of course,
yeah, the crystal L's. Yeah.
Now they go into this state and they're talking about things that sound very topological, you know, very space filling curvish with fractals and, you know, kind of unfolding, ever kind of kaleidoscopic things. And, you know, they're getting around to understanding that it's the what gland is it? I forget the little pine cone.
Usually the pineal gland of the pituitary is what they usually say it is.
They're kind of coming up with some stuff. They've even got one that can make this happen with light. But I think there's some huge implications here, because you have one generation that's saying, I've figured out some kind of a simulation effect that what I am is a system within some kind of a non-real environment, which, you know, obviously, if you could look behind the veil, you're not going to see Minkowski space. That was just something somebody made up on a desk. They're like, oh, this looks good. You're going to see something much more fractal-like and that follows Fibonacci's and such like, because that's what nature uses. Nature doesn't use Minkowski. That's just a metric to track something else. So they'll have this kind of an evidence-based religion now, that when you get there, you say, I have seen the face of nature or the real beyond the veil. You've been in some kind of a hyperdimensional temple of sorts. And everything that these beings on this other side tell you is that you're primitive and you'll learn someday that you're God. And I'm looking at this thing, well, this is going to be the new religion, because people want confirmation. And of course, the oldest trick in the book is you're God. I mean, you hear you're God, you should just turn around and run. But at the same time, it's the seduction through the whole Bible, you're God. But yeah, I'm really interested in following it, because for one, I think as I study it, there's going to be some topology. Somebody's going to be able to describe something that may have neurological implications, as far as what kind of, like, most likely your brain uses some kind of a hexagonal fractal compression system. But I think it's going to be really bad for the future.
Well, yeah, I think that it's definitely popular, you know. And I mentioned, you know, I told you I live in Austin, and it's all the rage here for sure. Now, I've never done that, and I'm never going to. Wait, what?
Have you seen the guy that used to work for Apple? He's like some kind of Eastern philosophy guy that has invented the Anja light.
No.
It's some programs, LEDs or something that they shoot at your pineal gland, and it gives you pretty much the same effect with no drugs. But here's the seduction: whether you do it with drugs or they advance this light system where you can get under it, an no less wise person could get in this thing and have this incredibly spiritual-esque experience, come out saying, I saw nature and I'm God, and I can't wait, I figured it out. And in spirituality, in a sense, what I think of as there's the bottom dwellers of the spirit world. You probably have in Austin like the grossest club. If you want to go there, the chicks are the grossest, the music, it's just nasty. You're like, yeah, you've been somewhere spiritual, you've been to the club. That's not it. But yet you can't deny that they may have had something extremely authentic happen to them. It's just not.
Yeah, so I'm reading about it right now, the Anja light. And yeah, I know that people have been messing with things like light sound machines and stuff. And so what I think about this sort of thing and the drugs as well is if you read about things like mindfulness and various forms of meditation, you are trying to long story short, you're trying to gain more control by gaining more awareness, by becoming more aware of what's going on in your mind and eventually your body. You have the ability to inhibit certain processes, but and one analogy I've heard, about mysticism versus psychosis is it's all the same body of water. It's all like the same pool, but one person is drowning in it. The psychotic person's drowning in it, and the mystic is swimming in it. And so you definitely want to voluntarily get yourself into one of these states, because you forged a path there for which you can turn around and go back. But if you drop, if you do DMT one day and you see a bunch of aliens that give you sacred knowledge, you may be able to bring that back. And some people say they're able to bring some of it back, but they can't truly integrate it into their being the same way that you can ultimately do with mysticism and other forms of meditation. So, but that's not what people are about. They're about the quick short-term results anyway. So
now that I added to the Facebook thing, there's this one guy that's got this new page, Puloff. His theology is pretty good, actually. I'm pretty impressed with the guy, and comes from one of these super mushroom hippie families, and he's a Christian, but he goes into these states with this Christianity. I mean, with his mushrooms, and he basically roams around as a Christian, telling these things that they're wrong. So you guys might find that to be fascinating. I do. He's only done 2 parts, but what he describes is basically it's very kind of car salesman-ish, that as you arrive, whatever, they'll try different methods on you. Can you be seduced? Do you like to be entertained? It'll be anything from gestures to things that look really cool. But as they get poor responses, they'll just move to the next sales pitch. It's very strange. I mean, it's kind of like you've entered a carnival of sorts. And
that is very interesting. And I was talking to Kyle about this the other day. Is different systems of mysticism throughout the ages have had different ways of dealing with encounters with these other entities, and some have handled it with more wisdom than others. And in Buddhism, you're not supposed to give in to any form of entertainment, not even no form of flattery, no offers of knowledge. And there's a saying, if you see the Buddha on the road, kill the Buddha.
Yeah.
And what that actually means is it doesn't matter if like some divine being comes down and sits in front of you and says, hey, let's meditate together. I'm going to show you how the universe works. You're actually just supposed to watch it pass. that's what you're actually supposed to do. There's all these hipsters who are dropping DMT and getting so-called sacred knowledge or whatever. It's unclear what they're actually letting happen in their mind or their brain, because what they say, Alan, what they say schizophrenia actually is when you hear different voices talking in your head,
kind of,
because if you actually let that happen, let these voices direct your actions, as is the case with schizophrenia, then you're possibly in danger as well as other people. But if you actually if you arrived at whatever this place is, this state of mind, through pure concentration, then you're going to have the ability to not let these voices direct your actions.
Right. Yeah. To me, I think the ongoing theme is convince everyone that comes here that they are God. If that's what you've accomplished, mission accomplished, you're done. They can come back and forth. They can do whatever they want. If they got that person locked down, they'll never, ever escape that zone. And what's strange is if you think about the idea of going to a dimension to find what, in the desert temptation, you have Jesus who said, look, I know you're hungry. Your body wants something. Just take it. You can turn that into bread. And he denies nature. He denies his body. And then he's like, look, prove that God is real. He's not going to let you get hurt. Jump off. The angels. All these things in DMT seem to be like truth-seeking missions. Like, let the body have what it wants. Prove to yourself what you need to prove. And then comes the final kill is take power. If you come out of there feeling like you gathered power, then you've succeeded. And of course, Satan says, just worship me instead, and I'll give you all the power you need. And in Jesus's DMT trip, let's say, when he's out in the desert, instead of saying, all right, I'm going to do it all, I'm going to eat, I'm going to experience what my body wants, I'm going to, test God, and he's going to have to produce these beings to save me, so I'll know that beings exist. I'm going to take power. I'm going to grab what I can. Jesus instead says, I'm going to go sit over there on a patch of dirt and starve. And that's, like you said, let the Buddha pass. It's the opposite. The idea of emptying self is true spirituality, not building self.
Yeah. And the other thing is, we've seen who the Iceman is, right, Alan?
Mm-mm.
He's the guy, Wim Hof, the dude who he meditates, and he's gained the ability to control certain let's see, his autonomic nervous system. I don't know, but he can withstand some really cold temperatures that would normally be lethal.
Right.
And that's nothing new. I mean, yes, he's gotten a lot of publicity, but they've done tests on monks, and it's not hard to meditate and get some lasting abilities, which is just control over your physical body. All the hippies and hipsters who act like they seen the burning bush because they dropped a bunch of acid, they don't come back with abilities like that, and more control over the body. They have gained no more control over the mind and body than what they had before. They may have realized, before I dropped this DMT, my mind was like a train on the rails, and the DMT pushed the train off the rails, and now it's back on the rails again until I do DMT again. Yes, you need to develop concentration.
Yeah, I think it's terrifying. I think it's going to get really bad. I predict real bad. Like 10 years from now, you'll practically have little hippie DMT churches, and there'll be some.
They already have ayahuasca churches.
There's a formula. I got to take a bathroom break. I'll be right back.
All right.
Alrighty.
Go ahead. All right. So we've been going on for about an hour and a half. So you guys want to close it off? I mean, we can talk afterwards, but we're starting to get off topic.
Yeah.
Okay.
In terms of live, I don't see the usefulness beyond the general point of the.
Did anyone want to talk about?
Though I do. Yeah, we'll talk about him afterwards. But when he comes back, I'm going to ask him one last question regarding his idea of the brain, and then yeah, we're done after that.
I had so many questions a while ago, but the flu just completely took it all out of me.
Yeah, yeah, we'll see. But yeah, we'll talk about Tom Jump after when we're not live.
That's what we all want.
Why? You don't want it live? Why not?
Well, because it's off topic. So
Okay.
yeah, it's fine.
We could do a separate one. I don't know.
Separate one, just talking about Tom Jump the whole time.
No. I feel like with the DMT stuff, there's such a loss of epistemic humility too that it's hard to bring someone back from that state of mind.
Yeah, people who do psychedelics, they think that they've really been there and back. And
yeah, I know, and they like it's beyond Gnosticism in terms of.
All right, Alan, you back?
Yep.
All right, we're gonna close it off. I just have one last question.
Yeah.
So when it comes to, you talk about the Anja, and I'm assuming that that's the part of us that's not produced by the brain, or like it's kind of like it's like molded onto the brain, but it's not like it's not reduced to neurochemistry in the brain, right? The Anja.
If you wanted to like be as like boring about it as possible, let's say, because the person's gonna obviously want to go there and try to reduce it to something terribly unromantic, is the Anja would be similar in programming, which would be considered like a character model, is this thing that's constantly emailing itself an image of itself. And the Anja would be your secret soul, your
I get that, yeah.
interior person. But that person is not a real-time person. That person, I mean, I see myself as an old man. I see myself as me now. I see myself tomorrow. It is not a person who's trapped in a moment. It's a person that is managing several different versions of yourself. And those are bound. And what's nice about these new brain models is those are bound as this kind of a fractal frequency nest of sorts. So you do have this complete, when you talk about, completeness, you have the ability for these things to be complete. They're not, little modules, all like spinning little bits and pieces. So in general, the Anja is the top clock of the mind, monitoring all these systems and maintaining these macro states of what it plans to be. Now, let's say you die. What is the Anja? In Romans 2, you see two different parties described. You have the people who have the law, who are subject to the law, and you have those who are without the law that are subject to a law written in their hearts. And it says, in the very last day will be judged according to the secrets of men. What I feel like is we're not carrying around a person that what we consider important to us would be things like our favorite movie and our favorite, things to eat and what we like philosophically. It's very possible that we're protecting a temple, that what we're doing is that temple is as a protector of the temple, our values and our structure that we create and we gather and cultivate, we're like one of these, angels guarding the gate. And that is our only thing. And the secrets that we're going to be judged by is, did we go in the temple? Did we fill the temple full of articles and items and ourselves? Did we mount the throne ourselves and say, I'm God? Or did we protect the temple? And whatever God wants from us, if he's like, you're going to erase all your favorite movies. We don't need none of that for the next dimension. I'm fine with that. I just want to prepare this thing, and I'm going to bring it to God like an egg. and say, I protected it. Here it is. I don't know what you want to do with it. That's my image of it.
Is there a reason why you've chosen to use the word anja?
Because in Eastern philosophy, it has to do with the you, the third eye that's seeing into the future.
Okay.
Okay, so you would say that if someone doesn't have an anja, then they're like a P zombie, right? They're like a kind of a, like they seem like it's like a artificial intelligence basically would be.
You could say the thing is that's where things get confusing, because in a sense, your volitional self, the one that you're experiencing visually and audibly, that is a P zombie. That's not a real self. The real self is this bound, quality-based being that doesn't need arms, doesn't need eyeballs, doesn't need anything. It's value-based, and it's philosophical, and it's full of intent, and it kind of is going around this world as if it's some kind of a gauntlet.
Okay. Okay, now that makes sense. I mean that makes perfect sense, because if you damage the brain, you damage your experience of the world. So I think that would that would be coherent, I guess.
And here the thing is, if you take this temple ontology to the end, you'll be like, but here's the problem, God. This guy's in a coma. This is a child that's going to die at 4 on a dirt floor in a hut. What are you going to do with that? God says that the first shall be the last. If God's only looking for the best, most pure temple, he's going to find those to be the most pure.
So what's the temple then? Would that be the brain?
The temple would be where the Holy Spirit, resides. And
well, I know, but where is that? Is that in the brain, or is that in the anja?
And it would just be an abstract quality. It's something that you've found to be sacred within your system of values, or you may be too impaired to do something like that. You may be too impaired to compete and fill the temple full of football and chicks and, self-import and all that. But at the same time, it's so strange that God is not saying, bring me a great person. I want a great person. No,
well, Alan, if you don't mind,
sure.
If you're willing to entertain ideas like the anja and other entities in the psyche as they appear with DMT and other mystical visions, then I'm surprised you would call the Holy Spirit something abstract. Because there's some books called the Philocalias where these desert fathers talk a lot about how to basically it's a lot like Eastern mysticism, in my opinion. It's what a lot of Eastern Orthodoxy is derived from. They talk a lot about the heart center, and they talk about the actual experience of the Holy Spirit, like an entity that kind of enters your mind.
Well, I can't put myself spatio-temporally anywhere. There is no way that you and I are in space-time having a conversation simultaneously. You could be 10,000 years ahead of me on a retread, or me. We don't know. So to me, I can't say, well, where is the Holy Spirit inside of me? I can see myself as a network, and I can see what kind of weightings and criteria I place to the Holy Spirit, and then I'm imbued with a certain value system that's like, okay, this system here, when it thinks of the entity, the abstraction of the Holy Spirit, not that the Holy Spirit isn't a real system, but I'm in the network relating to the values of the system, and I'm going to be, what do I do when somebody says, hey, system, Mr. Guy, do you want to do this with your day or do that with your day? Do you want to react this way or that way? Every time I'm injecting myself into the values, I'm becoming God in a sense. I'm looking for selflessness and not self-fullness. So I think when people want to say, well, where's the Holy Spirit inside of me? There is no physical me. There's just no way I can tie myself to a point in time and space. I'm just this weird relationship in a bunch of synchronicity So to me, the indwelling the Holy Spirit is returning me to the most synchronous state.
No, yeah, it comes down to values, but okay, that answers, I guess, my question regarding the Inja. So the Inja would be the unchanging part of our mind, but then our conscious experience, like right now, would be like you can like that's not a P zombie, but like, you know, if you damage your brain, get a concussion or whatever, that could change the way you experience. That can change your personality and so forth.
But
So,
the more, but here's the deal: the way, I mean, if you're going to go from a biblical standpoint, the more impaired you are, the less you're able to think for yourself. The more society or experience or you know, factors beyond your control affect you and tear you away from who you could have been. You are actually climbing the ladder to be the first and not the last. It's a very strange thing to think that the idea of goodness is not a spectrum that you can achieve by being better. It's a spectrum where you achieve by finding where zero is. And you could have somebody who's totally impaired. They're always a zero. They're always a temple. You know, you're the one that's going around mucking the temple up all the time, not this one. So it's very weird.
right, okay. All right, so I guess we can conclude that free will starts with the Inja. So, yeah.
Or something, but
you really want to end it on a Hindu note like that? Goes to Christian idealism, man. Might as well say,
I don't
praise
really,
Shiva.
well, I don't really care what you call it. I mean, angel, soul. I mean, they're all this. It's all the same thing. It's just
they're all terms that are placed upon abstractions in order for us to navigate through the terminology. You know, we're all a narrative.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm gonna stop the broadcast. So, thanks for watching and have a good day.
Guys, have a good night.